afternoon. And the good news is that I hope we'll end our session on time. I have a flight to Jaipur to catch, and I can't be late for that. So we'll finish in time, 5:15, something like that, as it's scheduled. It's an honor to chair a session on risk management versus agility. Although I'm not very clear if it's always one versus the other or if the two are actually very closely interrelated. But I'm sure I'll listen to the four members of the panel. From the government side, I always find it interesting as to how strictly our hands are tied when we are to award a contract or to administer a contract. So we actually run a contract with, as government officials, with our hands tied to our bags, because we are not able to explore alternative solutions midway very easily compared to the private sector, which does. And this can take very interesting forms. When I joined my new department on the 1st of January this year, I was reviewing some of the major drinking water supply projects, and we found that there was one small 60-meter land strip where land had to be acquired, and the payment had been made by my department to the district collector's office, and they just managed to give it to the wrong person 4 years back. And therefore, they were now planning that they'll first auction the land of the person to whom they gave that compensation to, and once they recovered whatever was wrongly paid out to them, then they'll pay money to the right guy, and then we'll get the right plot of land, and then we'll be able to lay a pipeline. And when we did our calculations, we found that the cost of not being able to provide water to 150 villages for 4 years was actually far less than this just 10 lakh or 15 lakh rupee that compensation was there. So I'm now having to sort of sensitize my own ecosystem that it makes sense for us to just do an additional expenditure of 15 lakhs, just get the money to the right guy instead of waiting the old money to be recovered, and let us have water supply reach 250 villages now, at least in time, after a gap of 4 years. So we find that it's always a case where there are strict rules. It's not as easy for us in the government to look for dual sources of supply. For instance, in the private sector, particularly in high-tech manufacturing and procurement, there's always, you have a multi-vendor system. You have vendors ready to replace. Should one subcontractor fail, you have a strategy in place to get somebody else on board because you're looking at multiple vendors. Now, apart from railways, which seems to do this, as a public sector organization, I'm not really aware of that practice too much elsewhere in my ecosystem. So it's definitely interesting for me, and I'm sure it's interesting for the audience to listen from all of you on this subject of how do you manage risk and how do you ensure agility in public procurement, particularly because, as I mentioned in the morning session when I was speaking, that unfair allocation of risk is probably one of the issues that sort of leads to contract administration problems in the government quite often. With those opening words for this particular session, let me introduce very briefly Mr. Chacko Joseph, who's Vice President, Head of IT Procurement and Finance for HDFC Bank. Amongst other things, he's been instrumental in designing P2P automation at the bank. He leads a team of senior personnel who look after various areas such as sourcing, procurement, budgeting, governance, and so on. We welcome Mr. Joseph to this panel. Our next speaker is Mr. Ravindra Sharma, who is Director of Value Realization, and he has worked has been working at SAP Ariba, and prior to which he worked as Vice President of GE Capital International Services. We welcome you, Mr. Sharma, to this panel. Mr. Simon is the lead procurement specialist in the governance global practice of the World Bank Group. He's been a civil engineer and 18 years of public procurement, after which he spent 11 at the bank. And I'm sure you'll bring immense value to this table, holding a master's degree in public procurement from the University of Turin, where someday I hope to do my PhD at some point of time. So welcome to this panel again. And Joseph Shine, a procurement specialist at UNICEF, who's a procurement professional with 2 decades of experience in the development sector and 14 years of experience in public procurement. So we have a very heavy group, all cutting-edge professionals in various aspects of public procurement. And the way I would like to suggest, if all of us can agree on that, is to probably have about 5 minutes from each one of you. That'll be about 20, and then we can have another 30 minutes or 40 minutes more of session.
So very good afternoon to all the delegates and the distinguished guests seated here and members of the dais. I'll briefly take you through the process of risk management versus agility in the procure-to-pay scenario. Due to paucity of time, I would just brush through some of the slides. This is the agenda which I had prepared. Basically, a procure-to-pay process consists of sourcing. Then we have the contract management, the requisitioning system, purchase orders, payment, and in the end, we have the spend analysis. This is how it would look in detail. So each aspect of this, in strategic sourcing, you have aspects like having the sourcing RFPs, RFQs, the sourcing projects to be identified, which are the projects for which you need to do a strategic sourcing, which are the normal procurement that you need to do. We have contract management. Once you've done the sourcing, once you finalize the supplier, then you need to ensure that you have a proper watertight contract so that it does not lead into any disputes in the future scenario. Then you have the requisition system where the end user or the user who actually needs the goods or services to be procured raises a request in the relevant system. And then you have the purchase order, the PO team, who releases the purchase order to the relevant teams. The suppliers get the POs. Based on the purchase order, the supplier would then deliver the goods or services. Some of the risk that is involved in this is, from a supplier management perspective, is having a quality set of suppliers, due diligence of a supplier from a financial viability perspective, to ensure that once you accord the project to a particular supplier, does he have the financial wherewithal to complete the project till the end? Risk rating and the process efficiency in evaluating and arriving at the risk rating for specific suppliers. RFP and RFQ needs to be watertight. As we seen earlier, in the earlier sessions, we have to lay down clear policies, guidelines, based on which suppliers should be able to quote for the goods and services that we need to procure. Auction strategy, that is an important aspect which many organizations misses out in the online procurement process. While everything can be automated, strategy is something which procurement professionals have to decide before each of the auction that they do, so that they get the best result from their auction. Coming to contracting, there are a lot of clauses that we need to look at, but some of the important clauses that you need to cover is the SLA, the milestones, penalty if applicable, incentives if applicable. Then you also need to look at the limitation liability, termination, and if there are any other charges associated while exiting certain contracts. Dispute resolution framework, what is available in the contract, and the overall risk of the contract, taking into consideration aspects like the supplier, what is the standing of the supplier in the market, what is his capability, what is his qualification with regard to delivering a project, the nature of project that you're going to award to a supplier, what is the risk associated with it, and then you finally decide of awarding a contract to a supplier. In the requisition process, you need to see whether the request which is come to you for procurement, does it really merit to go ahead for procurement? Does it have all the valid approvals and financial approvals in place? Releasing the PO to the supplier. Once you have all the approvals and necessary validation in place, and then you do the payment to the supplier. So these are some of the checks we thought should come under the supply management controls that you need to build in so that the risk can be mitigated at the supply management level. And they can broadly be classified into supplier level controls, sourcing level controls, and review level controls. That is, once you awarded the contract to a supplier, you need to review whether he's on track, is he delivering what he is supposed to deliver. In case he is not meeting the SLAs, are we initiating the penal action against them, penalty to be levied, credit note to be taken from suppliers. The other control that you can build is at the requisition stage, at the stage when you release the PO to the supplier and when you're making payment. Basically, what we are trying to say is, by automating the sourcing workflow, including supply portal, having an e-procurement tool through which you have the request, PO, and payment going to the supplier in single system. E-invoicing, where the supplier would give you an e-invoice in the same system. In case suppliers are giving you physical invoices, you should have a system whereby these invoices can be scanned and validations built in, which would then go into the system for payment. Three-way matching of PO versus invoice. Integration of your procurement tool with the accounts payable system. All this will help you to get meaningful spend analysis and trends, which will even also throw out certain exceptions. So there was a case study which I wanted to discuss, but due to paucity, okay. So it's a simple case study that we had mentioned. It was about automation in the end user asset procurement. So we have 80,000 plus users who are based out of 5,000 plus locations, based out of 2,700 cities across India. And simple things like they wanted to procure laptop, desktop, scanner, printers. In the end, when you see, it's a huge thousands of assets lying across so many branches, so many cities. So it was very difficult to manage this inventory and to ensure that whenever a user wanted a new asset, are there enough safeguards and validation in place to ensure that does he really need it? So what we did was, and the process was, there were multiple systems. They were not integrated with each other. There were some manual pieces in between, which led to data entry, re-entry of data into certain systems, which resulted into a lot of phone calls, emails coming into the procurement team. There was certain delays, payments were getting delayed, goods were not getting delivered in time, installations were getting delayed. So what we did was basically we automated the entire process, wherein the user had to just put in a single request for whatever asset he wanted. And once the request is put in, it would go through the various validations at the IT level, finance levels. Then the PO would go to the supplier. Once the PO is going to the supplier would update the expected delivery date in the system, which would go back to the end user. And once the actual delivery of the asset to take place, the user had to just go into the same request and just update the date. He did not have to fill in any other details, but just put in the date of delivery, based on which an automatic call would get logged for the installation of the asset. The asset would get installed for the user. Once the installation is done, details regarding the asset code and installation detail would get auto-populated into the request and the PO. Once the supplier does the e-invoice, all these details, matching happens between the PO, quantity, receipting. Then this transaction moves into the accounts payable system for payment. And that's how the entire process was automated. And the user had to just click twice, once while submitting the request, and the second time was when he actually got the goods, he had to confirm they got the goods. This helped us tremendously because there was ownership. No one could later on disclaim that they never got a goods or services for which it was paid. Similarly, for services, we had a mechanism where timesheets or milestones had to be confirmed and approved by the end user before payments were made to the suppliers. This helped us to have proper control to ensure that we are only paying for those goods and services which we have consumed and not for something which we have not consumed. And last but not the least, so my topic was agility versus risk management. So what I would like to say is agility, automation, and risk management can go hand in hand. It is like we ask, why do we need brakes in our vehicles? So that we can drive fast. So without risk management and automation, we can't have agility. And agility is important in today's scenario where we are processing thousands of transactions worth millions of rupees. This is the key to it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chacko, for confirming that thesis that I placed, that it seems that agility and risk management should go in hand. It's not a one versus the other situation, because the better you're able to manage your risks, the more agile systems you can obviously, the better you're at assessing risk, the better you're at allocating risk, the more agile your procurement system can be. Thank you for that. And I now invite Mr. Ravindra Sharma for about 8 to 10 minutes, and then we can go on with the next.
So by the time the presentation is coming up, what I'm going to talk about is on the session which says risk management versus agility. And I'm going to talk from a perspective of a CPO, Chief Procurement Officer. What can a CPO do in today's environment, which is so volatile, which is so turbulent, which is so dynamic, to take on the challenges of future? The risk on the other side, as Mr. Verma was pointing out, agility and risk. Agility helps you to exploit the market and be the leader. The other side of the coin is that if you don't move fast, if you are not agile, then you can get wiped out. And that's the key theme. We are saying sensing and seizing opportunity. Another dimension of the CPO or procurement as per the global best practice is no more the procurement is internally focused, talking about cost, compliance, efficiencies. Procurement is right at the seat of the board, talking market, talking strategy, talking external, and guiding their companies actively in innovations, product development, and consumer experience. That's the kind of procurement, that's the kind of agile procurement we are talking about. Look at the data from McKinsey. Look at the topple rate. Topple rate is defined the rate at which the leading companies are losing their leadership position. So if you look at the data between 1965 to 2012, the rate at which companies are losing their leadership position has actually gone up by 40%. And this is 2012. You all know the rate of change in the market is far higher today, and therefore the companies will lose their leadership positions much faster. So on one hand, there's a risk of losing leadership position. On the other hand, there are huge opportunities for new companies to establish leadership. And what differentiates? Why do these companies lose leadership positions? Why new companies come and dislodge them? What is the reason for that? And what is the role a procurement head can play? I can simply draw an analogy to understand and sum up the essence of it. If you remember the Gulf War, 1990-91, Operation Desert Storm, this was a huge win for the Allies. And one of the decisive factors for this win was the aircraft called F-61, the Falcon. And that aircraft made 13,340 sorties in that Gulf War, and very, very successful. So what's great about this aircraft? Is it faster? Can it carry more vehicle? Can it travel longer? No, none of these. Why this aircraft F-16 stood out in Gulf War as compared to any other aircraft is agility. There were so many missiles coming up. This aircraft was the best capable aircraft, and even till date retains that reputation. It's very agile. It can move much faster, dodge the missiles, gain the target, agile while retaining stability. And that's what a CPO should create, a procurement organization which is agile, which is changing to customer need while being stable. So it's like CPO, like a squadron leader creating this thing. Let me give you an example of a visual of what agility looks like. Let me start with sourcing, procurement, account payable, and risk, all three dimensions. Here is an example of automotive industry. So if I am a CPO of an automotive industry, what does this all agility mean to me? And the risk comes in three forms. A short-term risk, my supply disruption today, tomorrow. Mid-term risk like Brexit, global trade war. And a longer-term risk, the whole industry is getting disrupted. Here is an example of automotive industry. What is happening in automotive industry is that it is moving to a concept of what we call autonomous electric shared rides. And as per the Economist survey, by 2030, almost 25% of the rides globally would be in electric, self-driven shared rides, which means the total vehicle on roads in the world by 2030 actually is going to come down from current 1.2 billion to 600 billion. And the players are no more the Toyotas and the Volkswagen of the world. The players would be software companies like Google with Waymo, the shared ride companies like Uber, or the hardware company like Aptiv, right? So that's what's going to change. So that's what the environment a CPO faces. Now, what does it mean? What does it mean for a CPO as a sourcing organization? What should they do? What F-16 they should create? They need to have a very strong research and analysis wing which identifies these trends, the technology, the new partners, the new customer experience. That's the start point for a CPO to design their procurement function. Secondly, portfolio management. They need to build proactive relationship with a lot of new technology companies and startups. Give an example, Denso today has set up a $100 million firm as part of procurement to identify startups proactively and invest in them. Because every company today knows they cannot drive innovation on their own. It's a decentralized, democratic, federated innovation. So that's the second thing. Third is, from this example, the whole procurement needs to be redesigned to cater to new category expertise. It's no more engines. There won't be any engine, right, in a traditional ICE engine sense. There won't be any rear view mirror. There won't be any steering wheel in those things. It will be electric autonomous drive. So what they will need to create a capability is in terms of, for example, powertrains, computer vision, LIDARs, because that's done the autonomous part of it. They need to develop capabilities, for example, sensor. Today, on an average, the cars will use 100 sensors throwing out 25 GB data in the system. So they need to have category expertise of sensor. They need to have category expertise of software. They need to have category expertise of battery. For example, Telstra, they said that our claim to fame, we are the leading electric car company. It's not car anymore, it's the battery. And this is what, when it comes to battery, the core component of that is cobalt. Now, this is the kind of material which traditional CPUs have never focused. So they need to look at the new type of materials. They need to build a new business model. The whole procurement is now moving towards the what you call usage-based, benefit-based model, right? No more a mining company saying that I need to hire an excavator. Mining company is saying, you as a supplier, I'll pay per ton of metal created. So those kind of models, they need to come adopt. And supplier selection we were talking about, it's not, and I was hearing the debate in the last session, cost, quality, performance, etc. No, it needs to come to which are my supplier who can help me to do product innovation, to get new technology, to improve my customer experience. So they need to seriously look at the screen. So this is an example on the one part of agility, which is on sourcing and strategy. The second flavor would be on a supply chain. This is a live example of a consumer company. This company is making 290 million units, 30,000 variety of components. You can imagine the variety of product, if that increases, it brings so much complex in supply chain. Now this company was facing a challenge. The demand is fluctuating, demand is dynamic, and they need to fulfill it. They were putting a constraint-based supply chain plan, but the challenge is the constraint is not static. As we speak today, some suppliers somewhere would have developed a new constraint. How do you tap it? That's where they set up a digital agile platform to track all the, you can see, inventories and the constraint in real time. And in 60 minutes time, they could replan their system, leading to the benefits of not only $300 million inventory of the books, but on time in full by 5%. And on time in full reflects the consumer experience. And war is being fought on the experience level today. So that's one example of agile supply chain. This is an example of agile procurement. A leading European airline company, when they were doing procurement, traditionally you raise a requisition, it goes to somebody for approval, it goes to supplier. By the time it comes to supplier, I think battle is lost, so much time is there. That's not agile. What they did is they did complete automated part that on the mobile, you create the requisition, it goes to your approver on the mobile, and within 30 seconds, it goes to supplier sitting one continent away. That's agile procurement. And this company actually shaved off almost 480 million euro worth of inventory. And of course, the agility you can imagine. Take agility to the next level. Now, it is touchless agility. You have a machine which the vibration level of the machine goes up, as shown on the bottom part of the chart. Immediately, the requisition for the part which is causing vibration is released automatically through the system and goes to the mobile of supplier sitting one continent away, zero touch, no intervention. That's agile procurement. Let me give an example of agile account payable. We all talk about account payable, and many of the companies are supplying, I think, to the government, and they struggle with the payment cycle time. So here is a typical cycle time which happens from a supplier perspective for invoice processing, which is somewhere around 30 to 40 days on an average. This is our global benchmark. Now, there are companies which have completely transformed this process of doing fully digital. And with that, this is now the global benchmark. Multiple companies have achieved 3 to 5 days total for approval. This is what it is. Now, if you can approve all your invoices in a time frame, you are sitting with on a millions and $1 million worth of invoices which are approved, and then you can initiate things like supplier early payment discount, etc. And there are companies that have done, and a leading FMCG company again, when they walked this path, they created the entire account payable function from a cost center to a profit center because they could avail early payment discount by crashing cycle time and being more agile. And the last flavor of it would be in terms of risk management. Risk management today, tons of risks are emerging every day. There are hundreds of suppliers. How do you know? How do you tackle that? How do you respond with agility? And today companies have deployed digital platform. I'll give you a look and feel of it. There are companies which are tracking almost 600,000 sources of risk and 280 type of risk real time. And this is what, when a chief procurement officer enters the office every day morning, they see this kind of a graph, which means since yesterday till today, what are the new risks that have appeared? Which are the suppliers which are blue, which is okay, yellow or red, which warrant attention? What is on the right side? You see what is the type of risk that has come up since yesterday. Is it financial risk, statutory risk, operational risk, those kind of things. So this is the risk dashboard. This is your F16 dashboard for an agile squadron leader type of CPO. And this has been done successfully by a lot of companies. Leading mining companies in Australia was one of the first ones to do it, and now lots of other examples. So this helps in business continuity as well as reputation and brand risk mitigation. And just to last sum up, that today the CPO needs to gear up their organization to tackle the volatility and the new demands of the new time, and it will be a continuous process, not that you have established leadership today. And what they could do is maybe 4 things. They need to design their organization for sensing and responding, sensing in the market, the opportunities, supplier technology. They need to create a ongoing kind of a process for design collaboration, things like design thinking, innovation lab. These are the practices and processes that chief procurement officers should adopt. They need to create an agile technology. We looked at example of supply chain procurement, etc. Early warning system, that's the kind of a technology. And they need to build a team which is supporting collaboration, which is supporting digital literacy, which is supporting decision making and the leadership. And finally, they need to build a culture of change, innovation, proactiveness, and taking risk, failing fast. That's the kind of a culture, because world will be volatile, their company needs to be ready. So that's what I want to sum up. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sharma, for that speech. And I think if there's a takeaway for me, certainly the way I would like to see it is that as government moves more from procurement of goods and supplies to procurement of services, and then government moves to systems of performance-based contracting, I think whether government will become agile or not we'll discover in a few years' time. But what certainly will need to happen is that government contractors and suppliers of services, public services who are interacting with the government, given that the nature of government is changing from projects to services, I think they will have to become very, very agile in how they respond to ever-changing demands. I think that's definitely one takeaway, and thanks for letting us know the topple rates in the private sector. So I didn't make too bad of a career choice where the topple rates are much lower. Right? You can sleep happily now. Thank you for that. And we now have Mr. Simon Chirwa to speak to us for about 10 minutes on the issue of risk management and agility. Thank you.
Good afternoon. This being the last session of the day, now we have some risks. One of the risks that people are tired. The other risk is that the chairman of our session has to catch a flight. And we have to manage this risk, and he's asking us to be agile. So I'll try my best to be agile and see how much I can share in a meaningful way, but at the same time being agile. I come from the World Bank, and therefore we come from a very unique institution, different from other speakers, in that in the morning our colleague from the World Bank spoke. Those were, if I could simply say, buyers within the World Bank. So they were basically supporting the institution to run. I come from the operational side where we are interacting with government. So we have a different perspective on how we look at risk and what we are doing. I'll share you a few things, and I've been listening very attentively in the morning on what people have been sharing, very interesting. First, just to give a bit of advert on who we are as World Bank in India. World Bank in India is a development partner, as you know. We have 104 projects. Our commitment, 27 billion. We are working with 335 project implementing agencies. So these are the people who are primarily managing the risks. We are advisors to risk managers. And per annum, as of now, we have about 14,000 procurement activities or tenders that go through the World Bank. So I'll try to run through a few things that I think may be important in this aspect. First, from us as the World Bank, how we look at risk. So we try to categorize risk at 3 levels because we are a development bank. One, we're looking at who is going to buy these goods and services, and what are the risks. So this, we are trying to manage our own risk. And then we look at the contracting or acquisition level. What are the risks and how can those be managed? And then when we have also the actual contract management. Now, we have tools in the World Bank. One of the tools that helps us to look at risks at who's buying in terms of the organization, we have a tool, an online tool called PIRAMS, Procurement Risk Assessment and Management System. This tool helps us to see what are the risks, country risks, sector risks, implementing agency risks, governance risks. It helps us to see how these risks will evolve and how we can manage them. So that's more internal to us as a bank. Now, in 2016, the World Bank came up with a new procurement policy. Now it's no longer new because it's now 2 years old. And there's one very important aspect that was introduced in the 2016. In this 2016 policy, we require our borrowers, implementing agents, to prepare the project procurement strategy for development. And I will show you how this particular tool is very important in managing risk. So this is an example of a project procurement strategy for development. And I think what we have been talking about the whole morning becomes very important. When you're starting a procurement year at the beginning of the year, the first and most important is to categorize your supply. And you can have those suppliers just normal office suppliers. If you look at office suppliers and you're looking at agility, I think this is where GEM becomes very important, because this is where it's specification-driven procurement. But when you look at the upper quadrant, then you really are looking at judgment. Now, if you categorize your supply, this becomes an important tool for you to manage risks and where you should be spending your time. Now, at the procurement level, I think you know the risks, so maybe I would not want to dwell so much on those aspects. But I think we should also look at contracting as a way of managing risk. When there's no contract, all risk remains with the owner who owns the goods. But when there's a contract, then risks are shared. So contracting is an important way of managing risks. And this is a risk-sharing meters. And you can see when you have policies, which I saw in the morning, that at a certain point you need to have EPC only, or at this point you have to go through. I think the best way to arrive at it is to see how much risk you want to give away and what costs are you willing to pay for that risk. So that becomes an important part of managing risk. We now, as part of the agility, we are all going into the electronic environment, and we saw in the morning. But going through the electronic environment also has got its own risks. And there are a lot of system risks. We also have seen third-party risks. Normally in those government systems we're talking about, there are third parties who manage those systems. Those third parties on their own also have their own risks. So we need to be aware of those risks that come to with the electronic environment and how best we can manage them. And I think from the bank we have tools and systems which we have developed in trying to help us manage those systems. I think an important point which I would like to emphasize that procurement as a process has so much emphasis on clean procurement. And I see I was reading the GFR, and it basically one of the requirements that all tenders should be received in the EGP system. That's the government mandatory rule. But when you look further, there's no further mandatory requirement on how the procurement should or the contract should proceed beyond receiving. So that becomes an important point as far as the World Bank is concerned. And we have ways on how we think those those risks need to be managed. And one of them, of course, is state verification, where you have got a third party trying to verify what has been delivered. Finally, I think agility, as you said, the World Bank portfolio is very large, so agility becomes very important. As I said, we try to categorize procurement so that we spend much more time on those procurements which have got a lot of value and high risk. So that's an important part of getting agility. It's also trying to see what is the best way of getting those suppliers, where you want to get them internally within the country or externally. It also depends on how you categorize the supply that you want. And then also, as a bank, we do what we call prior review. We try to review the borrower's recommendation before they're awarded. There are two aspects. One, we are trying to de-risk the environment for our suppliers so that they have trust, in the system. But at the same time, we try to be choosy what we want to review so that we do not become a constraint in the implementation process. And we do promote the use of GEM, where those procurement are of low value, low risk. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. That was an extremely brief but enlightening presentation, because somewhere in the government contracting system, I find that we fail to appreciate the importance of proper risk assessment and proper risk allocation, particularly between the government and the contractors. And as government contracts move from very simple supply contracts, which you can do on GEM, as we move on to more and more complex contracts, infrastructure concessions, or long duration public service delivery contracts like medical and health services in rural areas on a privatized basis, or even allowing schools or education to open up to private players, I think the concept of risk allocation becomes extremely important. Attached to that is something that I've been doing work on, which when I train IS officers on government contracts, it's something that I always advise them to do, is to, of course, identify the risks which can happen at the contractor's end or at the government end, but even look at third-party dependencies. So if this is a contract between two parties, you are one department and there's a contractor, but if a pipeline needs to cross the railway line, if a pipeline needs to cross a road, if land has to be acquired, if electricity connections have to be applied to, which are all third-party bodies in that ecosystem, then try and identify that and make sure that those third-party dependencies are addressed in time. And one thing that we found in the course of implementing that principle is that you're always able to shorten the procurement life cycle and finish contracts in time. So thank you very much for that presentation. And we now have the last speaker, Joseph, who's a procurement specialist at the UNICEF. And welcome, Joseph, and we'll hear from you now. Thank you.
Good evening. I hope I can be heard. I'm not sure if the organizers were saving the best for the last, but I think they've got it wrong here by inviting me as the last speaker after the wonderful presentations that you've just heard. What I'm going to speak about mainly is just give you an overview of UNICEF procurement, risks and management, UNICEF tools, and because of the fact that Sir has to catch a flight, I'm hoping we won't have any questions at the end of it. So the critical functions which we do in supply in UNICEF is to actually meet the core commitments of children in emergencies by ensuring supply and logistics in times of emergencies for children. We influence markets, especially when it comes to supplies for children. We serve as a center of expertise for supplies for children. And we are also providing procurement services to various government partners and development partners. And we try and use product innovation to get better results at lower costs. So what do we procure? This is a small video, just less than a minute. This is what we do. These are 2017 stats. I hope you like that small video and the music, because it's going to go all downhill from now on, my presentation. But anyway, the next slide is actually showing the country of origin of suppliers. And you will see that maximum, the highest number is from India. The second is Belgium. And then third is United States. And fourth is Yemen. Yemen is an emergency country, and so we've got a lot of local suppliers there. But India is the biggest contributor when it comes to suppliers to the UNICEF, at least. I don't want to bore you with risk and definition of risk, because you all know what risk, and so I'll just skip this slide. But basically, we actually assess risk at all stages of the procurement cycle, right from the time of development of the specs till the time the goods and services is delivered to the end user. And we can actually, depending on the risk assessment, we either tolerate the risk if the risk is very minimal. We treat them to bring it down to a moderate level where possible. We transfer the risk, and one of the ways is by actually insuring goods and services. And if the risk is too high, we terminate, and we don't go ahead with the project if we find the risk is too high. I'm sorry, it's something wrong. It's not moving. Sorry, it's done. So risk management and agility, again, is actually the topic. So some of the ways we do it is through due diligence. We have principles and procedures for procurement. Our contractual provisions and GTCs are another way. And then UNICEF does a regular market scan and updates of the essential items that we procure. And then we have a couple of tools, Intent and Yammer, which we use. So I'll just go briefly through the stuff that we do. Vendor evaluation is something very critical within UNICEF. All our vendors need to be registered on UNGM, which is a portal used by all UN agencies. We have a supply evaluation unit in Copenhagen, which is our headquarters for supplies. They do a strict evaluation of all suppliers where the contract value is more than $100,000. The evaluation covers both financial as well as ethical checks. This is the portal, the UNGM portal, where actually you can actually search on a vendor whom you're intending to contract with, and it'll show you a hit in case there are ethical or financial issues with them. The UNICEF guiding principles are similar to all what other UN has, and it's about fairness, integrity, transparency, competition, economy and effectiveness, best value for money, as well as promotion of objectives of UNICEF. We believe that if we were to follow these principles, risk is minimized. And we require all our suppliers to sign up to this UN Supplier Code of Conduct, which covers labor conditions, human rights, environment, and ethical conduct. And we have a zero tolerance for corruption, which is the same for most organizations. Our contractual terms and conditions, again, emphasize all our policies. And Article 7, which relates to ethical standards, covers fraud, corruption, prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse, post-employment restrictions, conflict of interest disclosure, sanctions, and suspension. And we are very, very strict about ethical standards. So if anybody is found to deviate from this, we can just terminate the contract without any obligation on UNICEF. Again, when it comes to procurement compliance and oversight, we have various checks. One of them is actually planning for every procurement, especially for strategic procurement. We have a procurement strategy in place, which is developed with close coordination with the requisitioning team and also an understanding of the market. Then we have checks and balances built into the procurement system, segregation of duties, as well as a table of authority for sanctioning and approval of different stages of the procurement process. And we have regular monitoring of our procurement through internal audit and external audit, as well as through our SAP system. The reports are generated regularly to find out if there's been any deviation from the laid down procedures. This market scan and updates is something which UNICEF does quite a bit of, especially when it comes to medical supplies and vaccines. So we have a team again in supply division in Copenhagen, which is totally looking at the markets. And they develop these notes, which are again published on our website, about different critical items that we procure. And they actually talk about supplies, what are the risks, whether there is enough supplies available, if there are no supplies, what are the alternatives, and when are things going to improve, and what actions UNICEF is trying to take to improve this. Because we don't want to be in a situation where we are unable to supply the items which are required for children. Agility in procurement from biblical times, so those of us in procurement are suffering. We've been told that we need things every day, the previous day if possible, and we are struggling with that, all of us in procurement. So what we try and do is provide market alerts. We provide a pipeline of procurements that we plan to do during the year. So a calendar is published. We publish all our contract awards on the site. We also have supplier meetings where we actually talk to suppliers about our procurements during the year. We have specific category meetings as well. For specific items, we call in suppliers for that particular category, and we have meetings with them to understand the market. And many a time, we get innovative solutions from suppliers at these conferences, so this is something which we do quite regularly from our headquarters. We use long-term arrangements, which is also known as framework agreements, which is basically a way of getting suppliers on board quickly, because we have a broad framework agreement with prices agreed, and procurement afterwards becomes much easier with the contract issued against these framework agreements. We also have something like a catalog, which is there on our website, which again has a list of items that we regularly procure along with prices and vendors. So it becomes much easier to procure for all the 150 countries that we operate in. It becomes easy to go to that catalog and buy if something is required from that. This is again an innovation that we do. Target product profiles is basically about items which are not readily available, or something new which we have identified as required for our work, and we don't have a clear product available or a service available in the market. For this, we actually do what is called a target product profile, which is somewhat similar to the competitive dialogue process which the European Union has, which is an iterative process, because you go to the market with a broad specification and you tell them what is it that you want from that. And then you have a discussion with them, and then you fine-tune the specifications. And then when some products are available, we use those products as tests. We test them out somewhere in different countries. And if it works, then we go for the full tender. Some of the tools that we have is an electronic bid submission portal. You might be thinking, what's a big deal when e-procurement is being used everywhere? But in defense of UNICEF, we actually believe we have had the saying that says that if you're one step ahead, then you are a genius. And if you're 2 steps ahead, you're a crackpot. So we go slow on many of these things. So we are waiting for everybody to tell us everything works fine, then we will slowly get into it. But we are actually in this year trying to get more into e-procurement. We have something called Yammer, which is actually your 360, Microsoft 360 tool, which is actually connecting the whole supply procurement network across 150 countries that we work in. It is like a Facebook, an internal Facebook, where you can actually talk to people, you can put in queries, you get responses immediately. And this helps us in our managing risk, because for products that we are not able to find readily suppliers within the country, we are able to just post it there. And you will find hundreds of responses from colleagues across the world telling us this is a product which you might consider. If you want to know about a supplier, you just put in and they will give you the feedback on how the supplier has performed. in various contracts across the globe. So this is something which has been found useful for us in our management of procurement. And this has found mention in Forbes magazine as well. And it has won some accolades in other forums as well, and we've been asked to make presentations on this specifically by the team which handles the digital communities in UNICEF. That's it from my side. Thank you so much.